The warehouse stood silent in the industrial outskirts of Portland, Oregon, when Detective Sarah Chen arrived at 6:47 a.m. on March 19, 2023. What her team found inside would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the city's modern history. The victim, identified as Marcus Webb, 34 years old, had been dead for approximately 72 hours. The medical examiner would later confirm that death resulted from hypovolemic shock following prolonged torture. Burns, lacerations, contusions covering nearly every visible surface of the body. Ligature marks on wrists and ankles indicated extended restraint. The preliminary assessment suggested the victim remained conscious throughout most of the ordeal. The warehouse belonged to Thomas Gardner, a 52-year-old maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Beaverton. Gardner had disappeared. His truck was gone. His apartment, when officers entered with a warrant, showed no signs of struggle or hurried departure. Clothes remained in the closet. Mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter. But Thomas Gardner himself had vanished completely, as if he had simply ceased to exist. Detective Chen had worked homicides for 11 years. She had processed gang shootings, domestic violence fatalities, accidental deaths. This was different. The level of methodical cruelty suggested something deeply personal. This was not random violence. This was retribution. When she ran Thomas Gardner's name through the system, she found no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags whatsoever. He was described by co-workers as quiet, reliable, unremarkable, a widower who kept to himself, a man who went to work, went home, repeated the cycle. Then Chen noticed something in Gardner's employee file. Listed under emergency contacts was a notation from 2021, marked inactive. 2 daughters. Jennifer Gardner, deceased August 2020. Michelle Gardner, deceased November 2020. Both deaths classified as homicides. Both cases remained unsolved. Chen felt her stomach tighten. She pulled the case files immediately. Jennifer Gardner, 22 years old, had been a graduate student at Portland State University studying environmental science. On August 14, 2020, she left campus around 9 p.m. after a study group session. Her roommate reported her missing when she failed to return home. 4 days later, a jogger discovered her body in Forest Park, concealed beneath branches and debris. Cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Evidence indicated sexual assault. The crime scene yielded minimal forensic evidence due to weather exposure. No suspects were identified. Michelle Gardner, 19 years old, worked part-time at a coffee shop in the Pearl District while attending community college. On November 3, 2020, she finished her shift at 8 p.m. and walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away. Security footage showed her waiting alone. The next frame, recorded by a traffic camera 2 miles away, captured what appeared to be her getting into a dark sedan. The image quality was insufficient for vehicle identification. Her body was found 6 days later in a wooded area near Gresham. Strangulation, sexual assault, defensive wounds suggesting she fought back. Again, minimal forensic evidence. No matches in any database. The investigation eventually stalled. Thomas Gardner had lost both daughters within 3 months. Chen found records of his repeated contacts with the police department. He called weekly for updates. He hired a private investigator with money he borrowed against his house. He created missing persons posters even after the bodies were found. Posters asking for any information about his daughter's final hours. He attended every community safety meeting. He became, in the words of one report, obsessively focused on finding answers. Then, in early 2021, the calls stopped. The private investigator was dismissed. Thomas withdrew from public view. He continued working but spoke to no one beyond professional necessity. Colleagues described him as hollow, as if something fundamental had been removed from inside him. He sold his house in September 2021 and moved to a small apartment. He purchased the warehouse in December 2021, telling the real estate agent he planned to start a woodworking business in retirement. Detective Chen returned to the crime scene. Forensic teams were still processing evidence. She walked through the space again, noting the preparation. Heavy-duty restraints bolted to support beams, tools arranged with deliberate precision. A first aid kit positioned nearby, suggesting the perpetrator wanted to prevent premature death. This was planned. Every detail considered, every contingency addressed. Marcus Webb's background check revealed something that made Chen's pulse quicken. Webb worked as a delivery driver for a regional logistics company. His route included Portland State University. He made regular stops in the Pearl District. His employment record showed he had worked those exact routes in 2020. Chen pulled his vehicle logs. On August 14, 2020, he had made deliveries near the PSU campus. On November 3, 2020, he had multiple stops in the Pearl District. Webb lived alone in a rental house in Milwaukee. He had no criminal record, no history of complaints or incidents. He kept a low profile. Neighbors described him as polite, but distant. He never caused problems, never drew attention. The perfect facade of normalcy. Chen obtained a search warrant. What they found in Webb's basement would confirm her worst suspicions and reveal that Thomas Gardner's disappearance was not flight, but a deliberate choice. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a trophy room. Photographs covered one wall. Dozens of women, clearly taken without their knowledge. Surveillance shots, zoomed images, candid captures in public places. Among them, prominently displayed, were multiple photos of Jennifer and Michelle Gardner. Webb had been stalking them. For months, perhaps longer. Computer forensics would later reveal thousands of additional images, detailed logs of their movements, notes about their schedules and habits. More disturbing still, investigators found items belonging to both sisters. Jennifer's student ID card, Michelle's silver bracelet, the one her father had described in missing persons reports, a journal where Webb had documented his fantasies in explicit, horrifying detail. DNA analysis would eventually confirm matches between Webb and evidence from both crime scenes, evidence that had been insufficient for identification in 2020, but became conclusive when compared directly to a known source. Marcus Webb was not just a suspect. He was the killer. He had murdered Jennifer and Michelle Gardner. He had evaded detection for over 2 years. And somehow, Thomas Gardner had discovered this truth. The question now was how. And where was Thomas Gardner now? Chen stood in that basement, surrounded by evidence of unspeakable evil, and understood with absolute clarity what had happened. A father had learned who killed his daughters. A father had decided the justice system's failure required his own intervention. A father had become something else entirely. The manhunt for Thomas Gardner began immediately. But Chen knew, looking at the meticulous planning evident in that warehouse, that Gardner had prepared for this moment. He had known they would find Webb. He had known they would come looking for him. He was already gone. Jennifer and Michelle Gardner had been inseparable despite the 3-year age gap. Their mother, Catherine, died from breast cancer in 2017, leaving Thomas to raise them alone. He worked overtime at the manufacturing plant, attended every school event, learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, and became both father and mother. Neighbors remembered him at soccer games, sitting alone in the bleachers, cheering louder than anyone else. He taught Jennifer to drive in the empty parking lot behind the plant on Sundays. He helped Michelle with her college applications at the kitchen table late into the night. Jennifer had inherited her mother's dedication to environmental causes. She volunteered with river cleanup projects every weekend. Her professors at Portland State described her as brilliant and passionate, the kind of student who challenged assumptions and pushed everyone around her to think deeper. She wanted to work in conservation policy, to make systemic change. She had been accepted into a graduate program at UC Berkeley for the following fall. Thomas had already started saving for her moving expenses. Michelle was more reserved, but equally determined. She chose community college to save money, planning to transfer to a 4-year university after completing her associate degree. She worked 25 hours per week at the coffee shop, sending half her earnings to a savings account Thomas had set up for her education. She wrote poetry in notebooks she kept private. Her co-workers remembered her kindness, how she always remembered regular customers' orders, how she stayed late to help close even when her shift had ended. The sisters shared a small apartment in southeast Portland. They cooked dinner together most nights, simple meals with ingredients from the discount grocery store. They called their father every Sunday evening without fail. Those calls were the anchors of Thomas's week, the moments when everything felt right, despite Catherine's absence. He lived for those conversations, for the sound of his daughters laughing, arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes, planning their next family dinner at his house. August 14th, 2020, shattered that world. Thomas received the call from Jennifer's roommate at midnight. She had not come home. Her phone went straight to voicemail. This was unlike her. Thomas drove to campus immediately, searching the library, the parking lots, every place she might be. He filed the missing persons report at 3 a.m. The officer taking the report was professional, but detached. Young adults often stayed out. She would probably turn up. Thomas knew better. Jennifer always called if plans changed. Always. The 4 days before they found her body were the longest of Thomas's life. He barely slept. He printed flyers, walked every street near campus, talked to every student he could find. Michelle stayed by his side, equally frantic, equally terrified. They held on to hope even as it faded. When Detective Morrison called with the news, Thomas collapsed. Michelle caught him before he hit the floor. They held each other and cried until no tears remained. The funeral took place on a gray morning in late August. Over 200 people attended. Jennifer's professors spoke about her potential, her passion, her brightness. Friends shared memories of her laugh, her stubbornness, her unwavering belief that people could do better, be better. Thomas stood at the front holding Michelle's hand and said only 7 words. She deserved to live. Find who did this. The investigation consumed him. He called Detective Morrison daily. He reviewed every detail of the case he was allowed to access. He researched similar crimes, looked for patterns, constructed theories. Morrison was patient initially, but as weeks passed with no breaks in the case, the detective's responses became shorter, less frequent. The case was not forgotten, but it was no longer active. Resources shifted to newer incidents. Thomas understood the reality even as he refused to accept it. Michelle tried to hold herself together. She returned to work and school, but something had changed. She became hypervigilant, looking over her shoulder constantly, texting her father multiple times per day to confirm she was safe. Thomas noticed the fear in her eyes. He bought her pepper spray, insisted she take rideshare services instead of public transit, called her every evening to ensure she was home, and the doors were locked. But he could not protect her from everything. No father could. November 3rd, 2020. Thomas was working the evening shift when Michelle's manager called. Michelle had not shown up for her morning classes. She had not answered any calls. The manager had tried her emergency contact. Now he was trying Thomas. A cold dread settled into Thomas's chest. He left work immediately. He drove to her apartment. Her roommate had not seen her since the previous evening. She had left for her shift at the coffee shop at 7:30. That was the last confirmed sighting. Thomas called Detective Morrison. The detective heard the panic in his voice and responded personally. They reviewed security footage from the coffee shop. Michelle left at 8:04 p.m. Footage from a nearby pharmacy showed her walking toward the bus stop. Then nothing, until the traffic camera 2 miles away captured a blurry image of someone resembling her entering a dark vehicle. The license plate was unreadable. The driver's face was obscured. It was almost nothing. But it was everything because it meant she had not simply disappeared. Someone had taken her. 6 days later, a hiker found Michelle's body. The location was different from Jennifer's, but the method was horrifyingly similar. Strangulation, assault, evidence of struggle. The medical examiner's report confirmed what Thomas already knew in his soul. The same person had killed both his daughters. This was not coincidence. This was a predator who had targeted them specifically. Thomas stopped eating. He stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. He attended Michelle's funeral in a daze, barely registering the faces around him. The words spoken, The rituals performed. His supervisor placed him on medical leave. Colleagues brought food he did not touch. His sister flew in from Arizona, stayed for 2 weeks, begged him to see a therapist. He went to one appointment, sat in silence for 50 minutes, never returned. Detective Morrison worked the case hard initially. The connection between the sisters meant the killer had likely encountered both of them in similar contexts. Morrison's team canvassed the university, the coffee shop, the neighborhoods where both women had lived and worked. They interviewed hundreds of people. They collected DNA samples from anyone who had known both sisters. Nothing matched the partial profile from the crime scenes. The investigation eventually hit the same wall as Jennifer's case. No viable suspects. No clear leads. No justice. By March 2021, Thomas had withdrawn almost completely. He sold the house where his daughters had grown up because every room held memories he could no longer bear. He moved into a small apartment with bare walls and minimal furniture. He kept only photographs, clothing, and a cardboard box containing items from both daughters. Jennifer's acceptance letter to Berkeley, Michelle's poetry notebooks. The last text messages they had sent him preserved on his phone, which he read every night before attempting sleep. But Thomas was not merely grieving. He was planning. He had begun his own investigation, one that would span 18 months and ultimately lead him to Marcus Webb. How he accomplished this would only become clear later, when Detective Chen pieced together the meticulous trail Thomas had left behind. A trail meant to be discovered only after everything was finished. Thomas Gardner's transformation from grieving father to methodical investigator began with a single observation in April 2021. He was reviewing Jennifer's social media accounts for perhaps the 100th time when he noticed something in a photograph she had posted 3 weeks before her death. The image showed her outside the student center with friends. In the background, barely visible, was a delivery truck. The company logo was partially obscured, but Thomas enlarged the image until he could make out the name: Pacific Northwest Logistics. He cross-referenced this with Michelle's Instagram. 2 photos from September 2020 showed the Pearl District coffee shop where she worked. In both images, taken weeks apart, the same company's truck appeared in the background at different times of day. It could have been coincidence. Delivery trucks were everywhere in Portland. But Thomas had learned to distrust coincidences. He began compiling every photograph both daughters had posted in the months before their deaths. 5 more images contained Pacific Northwest Logistics vehicles in the background or periphery. Thomas created a spreadsheet. He logged dates, times, and locations of each sighting. He requested public records of the company's delivery routes through the city's business licensing department. The information was limited, but it confirmed that Pacific Northwest Logistics serviced both the PSU campus and the Pearl District regularly. Thomas called the company, posed as a potential customer, asked about their delivery schedule reliability. The customer service representative explained they maintained consistent routes with the same drivers to ensure reliability. The same drivers, the same routes, week after week. In May 2021, Thomas began surveillance. He parked near the PSU campus during hours when Jennifer would have been in classes. He watched Pacific Northwest Logistics trucks come and go. He photographed license plates and driver faces. He did the same in the Pearl District, sitting in coffee shops with a view of the street, tracking which drivers made deliveries to which businesses. It took 3 weeks to identify patterns. 4 drivers rotated through the routes, but only one worked both locations consistently. A man in his early 30s, average height, unremarkable features. Thomas photographed him repeatedly. Running the license plate number proved more challenging. Thomas had no official access to DMV databases. He considered hiring the private investigator again, but that would create a paper trail. Instead, he joined online forums dedicated to amateur investigation. He learned about public record searches, court filings, property ownership databases. He discovered that Oregon allowed limited public access to certain vehicle registration information through the Department of Transportation's online portal. The process was tedious and had restrictions, but Thomas had nothing but time. By July 2021, Thomas had a name: Marcus Webb, 33 years old, resident of Milwaukee, Oregon. No criminal record. No social media presence beyond a barely used Facebook account with privacy settings maximized. Thomas found Webb's rental address through a public property record search. He drove past the house repeatedly, memorizing every detail. A single-story structure with an unkempt yard. One vehicle in the driveway, the same truck from his surveillance photographs. No visible signs of other occupants. Thomas knew identification was not enough. Detective Morrison would need proof, and Thomas had only circumstantial observations. Webb drove a route that intersected with his daughter's lives. That fact alone proved nothing. Thomas needed evidence. He needed to connect Webb directly to the crimes. But he was not a forensic expert. He had no legal authority to search Webb's property. He could present his findings to Morrison, but would the detective pursue it? Would a judge grant a warrant based on Thomas's amateur investigation? Thomas doubted it. The system had already failed his daughters. He could not risk it failing again. In August 2021, 1 year after Jennifer's death, Thomas made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his remaining life. He would gather evidence himself, not for the police, not for prosecutors, but for his own certainty. He needed to know with absolute conviction that Marcus Webb was responsible before he could decide what to do with that knowledge. He purchased surveillance equipment using cash at electronic stores across 3 different counties. Small cameras, audio recording devices, nothing sophisticated enough to draw attention but functional enough for his purposes. The surveillance of Webb's house began in September. Thomas installed a small camera in a tree across the street with a view of the driveway and front entrance. He parked in different locations throughout the neighborhood on rotating schedules, watching for patterns in Webb's behavior. Webb worked weekdays, left for his delivery route at 6 a.m., returned between 6 and 7 p.m. He rarely left the house on weekends. Groceries were delivered. He had no visible social life, no visitors, no friends stopping by. He existed in isolation, which Thomas found both suspicious and convenient. October brought a breakthrough. Thomas had positioned himself near Webb's house on a Saturday evening when he saw Webb carry several boxes from his truck to the basement entrance on the side of the house. The boxes appeared heavy. Webb made multiple trips. Thomas's instincts screamed that those boxes contained something significant. He waited until 2 a.m., then approached the house on foot. The basement had a small window partially obscured by overgrown shrubs. Thomas cleared enough vegetation to peer inside. The angle was poor and the interior was dark, but he could make out shelving units and what appeared to be plastic storage containers. He needed to get inside. Breaking and entering would expose him to criminal charges. It would also potentially contaminate any evidence for official use. But Thomas was no longer thinking about official channels. He was thinking about truth. In November 2021, he enrolled in a locksmithing course at a community college, under a false pretense of starting a handyman business. He learned basic lockpicking, studied residential security systems, absorbed everything he could about surreptitious entry. His instructor commented that Thomas was the most dedicated student he had taught in years. December 2021, Thomas purchased the warehouse. He told no one his real intentions. The space was isolated, soundproofed by virtue of its industrial construction, and far enough from his apartment to avoid any connection. He renovated it slowly over several weeks, reinforced doors, installed heavy bolts, arranged the interior with specific purposes in mind. He told the few people who asked that he was building a workshop for retirement projects. No one questioned further. January 2022, Thomas entered Marcus Webb's house for the first time. Webb was at work. Thomas had watched him leave at his usual time. He approached from the rear, picked the basement door lock with hands that barely trembled despite the magnitude of what he was doing. Once inside, he moved quickly. The basement was exactly as disturbing as he had feared. Photographs covered the walls. His daughters' faces stared back at him from dozens of images. Thomas's vision blurred. His hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed to destroy everything, but he forced himself to remain calm. He photographed the walls with his phone. He opened storage containers, finding items of clothing, jewelry, personal effects. He recognized Michelle's bracelet immediately. He almost took it, almost claimed this piece of his daughter back, but he stopped himself. Removing anything would alert Webb that someone had been inside. Thomas found the journal in a desk drawer. He read 3 pages before nausea forced him to stop. Webb had documented everything: fantasies, plans, justifications, reflections after the acts. The level of detail was horrifying. Thomas photographed every page with shaking hands. This was evidence. Undeniable, concrete evidence. He could take this to Detective Morrison right now. But as he stood in that basement, surrounded by proof of his daughter's final moments of terror, Thomas realized he would not be going to the police. The justice system would mean trials, appeals, years of legal proceedings. Webb might receive life in prison. He might even receive the death penalty, though Oregon had a moratorium. But those punishments seemed inadequate, abstract, insufficient for the reality of what Webb had done. Thomas left the house exactly as he found it. He locked the door behind him. He drove home in silence. That night he opened the cardboard box containing his daughter's belongings. He read Michelle's poetry. He looked at Jennifer's acceptance letter. He made his decision. Marcus Webb would face justice, but it would be Thomas's justice, not the state's, and it would be absolute. Thomas spent February through May 2022 refining his plan. He studied Webb's routine with obsessive precision, logging every deviation, every pattern, every vulnerability. Webb stopped at the same gas station every Thursday evening. He purchased groceries online every Sunday. He drove the identical route home from work with mechanical consistency. Thomas mapped alternate roads, timed traffic patterns, identified surveillance camera locations throughout Milwaukee and the surrounding areas. The approach required careful consideration. Thomas could not simply abduct Webb violently. A struggle would leave forensic evidence. Witnesses might see the confrontation, and Thomas needed complete control from the beginning. He needed Webb to come willingly, to enter a situation without suspicion, to place himself in Thomas's hands voluntarily. This meant creating a scenario that Webb would find both plausible and irresistible. In June 2022, Thomas created a false identity. He opened a post office box under the name David Morrison in Vancouver, Washington. He purchased a prepaid phone with cash. He established an email account using public Wi-Fi at a library across the state line. Everything was designed to be untraceable to his real identity. Then he crafted a message carefully worded to appeal to Webb's specific psychology based on what Thomas had learned from the journal. The email, sent from an anonymous account, claimed to be from someone who shared Webb's interests. It referenced specific details that only someone familiar with Webb's particular obsessions would know, details Thomas had gleaned from the journal entries. The message proposed a meeting to discuss mutual interests, suggesting a location that would seem safe to Webb, a public park during daytime hours. Thomas knew Webb would be cautious, possibly suspicious, but the lure of finding someone who understood him would be powerful. Webb responded within 48 hours. His reply was guarded but interested. They exchanged several messages over 2 weeks, with Thomas gradually building trust, demonstrating knowledge that validated his claims. Finally, Thomas suggested meeting at a location he had chosen specifically, a rest area off Highway 26, isolated enough for Thomas's purposes but public enough to seem legitimate. Webb agreed to meet on Saturday, July 16th at 2 p.m. Thomas arrived 3 hours early. He parked his truck, different from his regular vehicle, purchased used with cash 2 months prior, and registered under the false Vancouver identity. He positioned himself with clear views of all approaches. At 1:58 p.m., Webb's sedan pulled into the rest area. Webb parked, remained in his car for several minutes, clearly scanning for threats. Thomas waited. Finally, Webb exited his vehicle and walked toward the picnic area where Thomas had specified they would meet. Thomas approached casually, offered a handshake, began a conversation scripted to put Webb at ease. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. Thomas mentioned having materials in his truck that Webb might find interesting. items too sensitive to discuss in the open. Webb hesitated. Thomas read the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of curiosity against caution. Curiosity won. They walked to Thomas's truck together. The interior had been modified, handles removed from rear doors, windows tinted beyond legal limits. The moment Webb climbed into the passenger seat, Thomas moved with precision born from months of mental rehearsal. The stun gun, purchased through an online marketplace and delivered to the Vancouver post office box, delivered its charge before Webb could react. His body convulsed. Thomas applied the restraints immediately, heavy-duty zip ties around wrists and ankles, duct tape across the mouth. Webb's eyes showed panic, confusion, then the beginning of terrible understanding. Thomas drove carefully, observing all traffic laws, taking routes he had practiced dozens of times. 40 minutes later, they arrived at the warehouse. Thomas backed the truck inside, closed the door, and sat in silence for a full minute, staring at Webb's terrified face in the rearview mirror. Then he spoke the only words he would say before beginning. "You killed Jennifer and Michelle Gardner. I am their father. You will not leave here alive." Webb thrashed against the restraints. Muffled sounds came through the tape. Thomas ignored them. He dragged Webb from the truck and secured him to the bolted restraints he had installed months earlier. Then Thomas retrieved the journal, the one he had photographed but left in Webb's basement. He had returned one final time the previous week to take it, knowing he would need it for this moment. He opened to the entries about his daughters and began reading aloud. Webb's eyes widened with recognition and horror. Thomas read every word in a flat, emotionless voice. The descriptions of stalking Jennifer, the fantasies about Michelle, the detailed accounts of what Webb had done to them before killing them. Thomas read for over an hour, forcing Webb to hear his own words, to confront the reality of his actions through his own documentation. When Thomas finished reading, he closed the journal and placed it carefully on a nearby table. Then he looked at Webb and said, "You made them suffer. You will understand what that means." What occurred in that warehouse over the following hours would later be partially reconstructed through forensic evidence, though Thomas never provided a complete account. The medical examiner would determine that Webb died between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. from accumulated trauma. The suffering was prolonged, methodical, designed not for information extraction, but for retribution. Thomas had prepared tools, medical supplies to prevent premature death, and a level of focused rage that had been building for 22 months. When Marcus Webb finally died, Thomas sat in silence for 30 minutes. No satisfaction came, no sense of closure, only emptiness and the knowledge that his daughters remained gone. He had imagined this moment countless times, believing that Webb's death would bring some measure of peace. Instead, he felt nothing but exhaustion and the weight of what he had become. Thomas cleaned methodically. He had studied crime scene investigation procedures during his months of planning. He knew about luminol, DNA transfer, fiber evidence. He wore disposable coveralls purchased from industrial supply stores, latex gloves, shoe covers. He had lined portions of the warehouse floor with plastic sheeting. Everything contaminated went into heavy-duty trash bags. He scrubbed surfaces with bleach solution. He knew this would not eliminate all evidence, but it would complicate forensic analysis. The body remained in the warehouse. Thomas had always intended this. He wanted Webb found. He wanted the evidence of Webb's crimes discovered. The photographs on the walls, the journal, the items belonging to his daughters. All of it needed to be documented by authorities. Webb's death would be ruled a homicide. Thomas would be identified as the perpetrator. But the truth about Jennifer and Michelle would finally be established with certainty. Their cases would be solved. Other families who had suffered from Webb's predation would have answers. Thomas locked the warehouse at 4:17 a.m. on July 17, 2022. He drove to a remote location in the Mount Hood National Forest, burned his clothing and the disposable coveralls in a fire pit, then buried the ashes. He returned home, showered for 40 minutes, and sat at his kitchen table as dawn broke. He had prepared for this next phase as carefully as everything else. The plan was straightforward. disappear long enough for Webb's body to be discovered and the investigation to develop, then surface in a location far from Oregon where extradition would be complicated but not impossible. He had chosen the Cayman Islands. No extradition treaty with the United States, but a relationship close enough that he could eventually be returned to face charges once he was ready. Thomas had no intention of evading justice permanently. He simply needed time to ensure the evidence about Webb was thoroughly documented before surrendering himself. He had prepared a secondary identity months earlier. Passport obtained through document fraud services he found on dark web forums. Bank accounts established in offshore locations. Cash reserves accumulated slowly through careful saving and liquidation of assets. He had converted nearly everything he owned into portable wealth. The apartment lease was month to month. His few possessions fit in 2 suitcases. On July 18th, Thomas withdrew the maximum daily limit from 3 different ATMs. On July 19th, he drove to Seattle, left his truck in long-term parking at SeaTac Airport with a note in the glove compartment containing the location of the warehouse, and boarded a flight to Miami using his legitimate identification. From Miami, he flew to Grand Cayman under the false identity. By July 21st, he was registered at a small hotel in Georgetown under the name David Morrison. Back in Portland, Marcus Webb's absence went unnoticed initially. He had no close relationships, no one who would immediately question his disappearance. His employer marked him absent without notification, a terminable offense, but assumed he would eventually contact them or simply never return. This happened occasionally with employees who found other opportunities or decided to move without notice. The discovery came on August 3rd, when a real estate agent showing the industrial property to a potential client noticed the smell. She called police. Detective Chen responded with a patrol unit. They entered the warehouse and found Webb's decomposing body still secured to the restraints. The scene was immediately classified as a homicide. The forensic team processed the warehouse over 4 days. They documented the restraint system, the tools, the evidence of prolonged torture. They found Webb's vehicle hidden behind the building. They photographed everything before carefully removing items for laboratory analysis. Blood spatter patterns, DNA samples, fingerprints, fiber evidence. The investigation was exhaustive. The breakthrough came when they identified the warehouse owner. Property records showed it belonged to Thomas Gardner. Chen pulled his file immediately and saw the connection to the 2 unsolved murders from 2020. She sent units to Thomas's apartment, empty. His truck was located at SeaTac Airport 3 days later, with the note directing police to the warehouse. Chen returned to Webb's house with a complete forensic team. What they found in the basement validated everything. The photographs, the journal, the trophies from multiple victims. DNA testing began immediately. Within 2 weeks, they had confirmed Webb's involvement in Jennifer and Michelle Gardner's murders. Further testing connected him to 2 additional sexual assaults from 2019 and 2020. The case exploded in the media. Father's revenge and vigilante justice dominated headlines. Public opinion divided sharply. Some saw Thomas as a hero who accomplished what the justice system could not. Others viewed him as a murderer who took the law into his own hands. Talk shows debated moral philosophy. Legal experts discussed the implications for the criminal justice system. Detective Chen focused on finding Thomas. His bank accounts showed activity in the Cayman Islands. Immigration records confirmed his entry under the David Morrison identity. Chen contacted Interpol and began extradition proceedings. But the Cayman Islands government moved slowly. Thomas Gardner had committed no crime on their soil. Extradition required diplomatic processes that could take months. Thomas Gardner lived in the Cayman Islands for 8 months. He rented a modest apartment overlooking the Caribbean, worked occasional construction jobs under his false identity, and spent most evenings sitting on the beach watching the sunset. He did not attempt to hide aggressively. He knew he would eventually be found. He simply wanted time to exist outside the cage of grief that had defined him since August 2020. He read news coverage of the case through VPN-protected internet connections. He learned that Webb had been definitively connected to his daughter's murders and to other crimes. He read interviews with families of Webb's victims, expressing gratitude that their cases were finally solved. He read editorials debating whether his actions were justified. He absorbed it all with detachment, as if reading about someone else's life. On March 12, 2023, Thomas walked into the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown and surrendered himself. He provided his real identification, confirmed his identity, and stated he was wanted for murder in Oregon. Embassy officials contacted the FBI immediately. Thomas was taken into custody, held pending extradition processing, and transferred to U.S. Marshals 17 days later. He waived his right to fight extradition. He wanted to return. He was ready to face what came next. Detective Chen met him when he arrived in Portland. She read him his rights formally, though he had been advised of them multiple times already. Thomas waived his right to an attorney initially and gave a complete confession. He detailed everything: the investigation, the surveillance, the planning, the abduction, and the killing. He showed no remorse for Webb's death but acknowledged full responsibility. When Chen asked why he surrendered, he said simply, "I did what I needed to do. Now the system can do what it needs to do." The trial began in September 2023. The prosecution charged first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, torture, kidnapping, and premeditation. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas's confession, forensic evidence from the warehouse, surveillance footage, financial records tracking his preparation. The defense, provided by a public defender after Thomas refused private counsel, argued diminished capacity due to extreme emotional disturbance. They presented the context: a father who lost both daughters to a serial predator, who discovered evidence the police had missed, who took action when the system failed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Families of Webb's other victims testified, many expressing conflicting emotions. They were grateful Webb could harm no one else, grateful for closure, but disturbed by the brutality of his death. Jennifer and Michelle's college friends testified about the impact of their murders. Thomas's former co-workers described his deterioration after losing his daughters. Psychologists debated his mental state. Legal scholars discussed vigilantism and the boundaries of justice. Thomas testified for 6 hours. He spoke without emotion about discovering Webb's identity, about the decision to act independently, about what occurred in the warehouse. When the prosecutor asked if he felt remorse, Thomas said, "I regret that the system failed so completely that I felt this was necessary. I regret that my daughters died terrified and alone. I regret that Marcus Webb existed, but I do not regret stopping him." The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Thomas Gardner guilty of second-degree murder, rejecting the first-degree charge due to acknowledging the extreme emotional circumstances. The conviction carried a sentence of life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years. At sentencing, Judge Patricia Hoffman addressed Thomas directly. "You took a life with premeditation and extreme cruelty. Regardless of Marcus Webb's crimes, you became a torturer and a killer. Society cannot function if individuals appoint themselves judge and executioner. However, I acknowledge that you acted from a father's anguish after systemic failures left you without recourse. You will serve no less than 25 years in prison. What you did can never be condoned, but perhaps it can be understood." Thomas was transferred to Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. He adapted to prison life with the same methodical approach he had applied to everything else. He worked in the prison library. He avoided conflicts. He spoke rarely but was considered respectful by guards and inmates alike. He received letters weekly from strangers, some praising him, others condemning him. He read none of them. In interviews years later, Detective Chen reflected on the case. Thomas Gardner did what he believed he had to do. Was it justice? Legally, no. Morally, that depends on your philosophy. What I know is that Marcus Webb killed at least 2 young women and assaulted others. He would likely have continued if Thomas hadn't stopped him. The system failed Jennifer and Michelle Gardner. It failed their father. And in that failure, we created the circumstances for tragedy to compound itself. Public opinion remains divided. Annual debates resurface around the case, particularly in discussions about criminal justice reform, victims' rights, and the death penalty. Thomas Gardner's name appears in ethics courses, law school seminars, and true crime documentaries. He has become a symbol of both the failure of justice and the danger of its absence. Thomas will be eligible for parole in 2048 at age 77. He has stated he will not seek early release. In his only public statement given through his attorney in 2024, he said, "I want families to know their daughters are not forgotten. I want the system to do better. And I want my daughters to know their father loved them enough to ensure their killer faced consequences. That is all I have to say." Jennifer and Michelle Gardner are buried beside their mother in Willamette National Cemetery. Thomas has photographs of their graves in his cell. He has never had visitors.